Thank you so much for joining me tonight on MaicaLan. I truly hope that tonight's story has brought a sense of calm to your heart and gently guided you into a peaceful, restful sleep under the quiet, starry sky. If these bedtime stories have helped you relax and ease into sleep, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell. This way, you'll never miss a new episode. And it's a simple way to support the channel while making sure you always have a soothing story waiting for you at the end of a busy day. In a small village nestled between green hills, there was a potter named Henry. Known for his skill in crafting exquisite and beautiful pottery, his workshop sat at the edge of the village, where the morning sunlight streamed through a small window, brightening the workspace. The scent of clay, kiln smoke, and the moisture of early dawn intertwined, creating a peaceful and serene atmosphere. Every day, Henry rose early, prepared his tools, and began his work with careful attention to detail. The pots he crafted were admired by the villagers for their beauty and precision. Yet Henry himself never felt satisfied. To him, none of his pieces were ever quite perfect. His keen eyes always spotted tiny flaws that others could never notice. A barely visible crack, a curve that wasn't quite right, or a color that didn't match his vision. The workshop was where Henry spent all his time. Outside, a small garden surrounded his workspace, where freshly crafted pots were laid out in the sun. The soft morning light bathed the pottery, highlighting the smoothness of the clay shaped by Henry's hands. The atmosphere was calm and quiet, broken only by the birdsong and the gentle breeze. But in Henry's heart, there was unrest. Though he was regarded as the most talented potter in the village, Henry could never feel content with his creations. Each one, despite being meticulously crafted, left him with a sense of incompleteness. From a young age, Henry had nurtured a dream of creating the perfect pot, one with no flaws. During his apprenticeship with his master, he had learned that perfection was the ultimate goal in the art of pottery. This belief had become central to his life. And from that point on, Henry relentlessly pursued this ideal, believing it was the essence of his craft. Each day, Henry worked diligently, selecting only the finest clay, molding it with precision, and watching closely during the firing process. When he opened the kiln, he always hoped to find a flawless pot. But no matter how many times he tried, he always felt something was wrong. The perfection Henry sought seemed like an illusion. A tiny scratch or an almost imperceptible crack would drive him to frustration. He began to wonder if he was not skilled enough, or if there was something beyond his control that he had yet to master. And so, he immersed himself in his work, day and night, pushing himself to create something better. But eventually, he became exhausted. As the years passed, the joy Henry had once found in creating pottery was replaced by the weight of expectation. His passion, which had once brought him happiness, now felt like a burden. He no longer took pride in his work. Instead, he felt a deep disappointment every time he discovered a small flaw. Henry grew tired, but he couldn't stop. In his mind, perfection was still the only goal worth pursuing, and he couldn't accept that he might never achieve it. However, deep inside, Henry began to wonder if he had been missing something. Was perfection truly that important? And if he never achieved it, would his life lose its meaning? One quiet morning, as he gazed at the pots drying in the sunlight, Henry suddenly realized he had overlooked many important things around him. The stillness of life, the simple joys he had once enjoyed, had faded into the background of his relentless pursuit of perfection. Looking at his pots, he saw that they were beautiful, but they lacked something he couldn't quite name. As his thoughts wandered, Henry realized that his journey was entering a new phase. One where he would learn to accept and appreciate imperfections. And as he opened his heart to this new understanding, his life began to change in ways he had never imagined. Henry wasn't always obsessed with perfection. As a young potter, he had been filled with passion and excitement. In those early days, every pot he made was a source of immense joy. His hands, though inexperienced, were guided by his enthusiasm. Each time he shaped the clay, he felt the thrill of creation, sensing every curve as it formed beneath his fingers. The first time Henry crafted a pot, it wasn't perfect, but he was proud. He vividly remembered presenting the small, uneven brown pot to his master, whose eyes lit up, not because the pot was flawless, but because it reflected the spirit of a young apprentice eager to learn. Creativity begins with trial and error, his master had once told him. These words fueled Henry's early years in the trade. He didn't care about small cracks or rough edges. He focused only on the freedom and joy of making something new. Henry often looked at his pots with satisfaction, even smiling at their uneven lines. However, as Henry's skills improved, so did the expectations of those around him. Villagers and customers began to expect more from him. Every pot Henry made received praise. And gradually, he no longer felt content with pieces that had even the tiniest flaw. The joy of his craft began to turn into a pressure to produce only perfect work. As time passed, Henry poured all his energy into creating flawless pottery. He constantly refined his techniques, searched for better materials, and learned to control every tiny detail. From selecting the perfect clay to shaping it meticulously, Henry checked and rechecked every step, refusing to allow any mistake. Henry spent days searching for the finest, softest clay from the surrounding hills. He carefully molded it, paying attention to every small detail. Once the pot was shaped, he would scrutinize it for hours, searching for any tiny imperfection. If he found even the slightest flaw, he would immediately fix it or start over from scratch. Even the firing process, an essential step in the formation of the final piece, wasn't immune to Henry's exacting control. He would stand by the kiln for hours, adjusting the heat to ensure that every pot was fired under the perfect conditions. Each time he opened the kiln, his heart would race, waiting to see if his efforts had finally produced the perfect piece. But no matter how hard he tried, some pots still came out with tiny cracks or uneven colors. Henry felt a deep sense of failure, wondering if he simply wasn't good enough. The obsession with perfection began to seep into every part of Henry's life. He no longer saw his work with pride but felt defeated every time a tiny flaw was revealed. His life became rigid, devoid of the freedom and joy he once found in creating pottery. After years of striving for perfection, Henry began to feel worn out, both physically and mentally. The long days spent standing by the kiln, with hands constantly shaping clay and a mind always racing, had drained his energy. The pressure he had put on himself to create perfect pottery had stripped away the joy and creativity he once held dear. Instead of feeling excited about starting a new project, Henry now dreaded the thought of another failure. His work hours stretched endlessly in silence, broken only by the crackling of the kiln and his own weary sighs. Henry no longer found pleasure in the simple things around him. The beauty of the garden outside, the sound of birds, or the softness of the clay. Everything had become dull and meaningless. His exhaustion didn't just affect his work, it seeped into his personal life as well. Henry began to withdraw from his friends and stopped attending the village gatherings. He isolated himself in his workshop, growing distant from everything and everyone. The things that had once brought him joy now felt foreign and empty. One day, while sitting in front of the kiln, Henry realized that he had lost his passion for the craft. He began to wonder why he had started making pottery in the first place, and whether his original goal of perfection still held any meaning. That moment of reflection marked the beginning of a new journey, one in which Henry would rediscover joy and purpose, not by chasing perfection, but by embracing the beauty in imperfections. It wasn't long after that moment when, in a particularly fatigued and uninspired state, Henry accidentally crafted a pot with a small crack. At first, the crack felt like yet another disappointment, a reminder that perfection continued to elude him. He lifted the pot from the kiln, fully intending to discard it, as he had done with countless others before. Yet, something stopped him this time. He held the pot in his hands, examining it closely. The crack was slight, barely noticeable. But to Henry, it stood out starkly. The pot still carried a certain beauty, despite, or perhaps because of, the flaw. For the first time, Henry paused and really looked at the pot. There was something about the way the crack followed the natural curve of the pot, as if it had been a part of its design all along. It felt raw, real, and somehow alive in a way that none of his flawless pieces ever had. As he studied the pot, Henry found himself asking a new question: was perfection truly necessary to create beauty? Was it possible that the flaw, rather than being a mistake, was what made this pot unique? Sitting quietly in his workshop, Henry began to understand something deeper. The crack wasn't a defect, it was part of the pot's story, a result of the natural process that he could never fully control. And it was this very unpredictability, this imperfection, that made the pot beautiful. This realization began to change Henry's outlook on his work. He started to reflect on the standards of perfection he had imposed on himself for so many years. Why had he become so obsessed with creating flawless pieces? Had the pursuit of perfection really brought him happiness? Or had it merely made him more distant from the things he loved? Henry understood that perfection wasn't what gave a piece of pottery its value. The tiny flaws, the unexpected cracks, were what made each piece unique, giving it character and life. He realized that what made a pot truly valuable wasn't the absence of mistakes, but the journey it had been through, the effort, the creativity, and the imperfections that told its story. Henry decided to let go of his obsession with flawless pottery. He began experimenting with new techniques, allowing the natural processes of the clay and kiln to guide his work. No longer fixated on avoiding every flaw, Henry found a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. Each piece he made now carried its own imperfections. But instead of seeing them as failures, Henry embraced them. He cherished the cracks, the uneven shapes, and the unpredictable colors because they were the marks of a creative process that was alive and true. The pots he crafted became more vibrant, more personal, and more meaningful. With this newfound approach to his craft, Henry rediscovered the joy he had once felt. He remembered the early days of his apprenticeship when shaping clay brought him pure delight. Now, each day in the workshop was no longer a battle for perfection but a return to the excitement and freedom of creativity. Henry began to explore new ideas, shapes, and materials he had never considered before. He played with different types of clay, embracing their natural variations and allowing himself to experiment without fear of failure. Sometimes he created pots with odd shapes, not following any traditional rules. But he felt more alive and fulfilled than ever. The joy of creation returned, and with it came the desire to share his work with others. Henry no longer worried about whether his pots would be accepted or praised. Instead, he felt confident that each one reflected his spirit and the story he had to tell. A story of imperfection, freedom, and joy. Every time Henry saw someone smile while holding one of his pots, he felt a deep sense of happiness. No longer burdened by the need to impress or meet impossible standards. He was simply grateful for the connection his work created. His pieces were no longer mere objects, they were filled with meaning. Each one a testament to his journey of learning to accept and love the imperfections of life. As Henry embraced imperfection in his work, he began to see beauty in the simple things around him. Things he had once overlooked. Before, he had been so consumed by his pursuit of perfection that he hadn't taken the time to appreciate the world around him. But now, as he slowed down and allowed himself to be present, he found that life was full of small, quiet moments of beauty. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered into his workshop, Henry would take a few moments to sit in stillness, appreciating the world around him. The sound of birds chirping in the nearby trees, the gentle rustle of the wind through the garden, and the soft squish of clay in his hands. All these things became sources of peace and inspiration. These small details made Henry feel more connected to the world, and he began to treasure them in a way he never had before. Henry found new joy in the simple pleasures of life. A cup of hot tea in the morning, the wildflowers blooming along the path, or the cool breeze blowing through his small garden. All these things became precious to him. He realized that true peace came not from achieving great things but from learning to pause, breathe, and appreciate the beauty of the world around him. Each time he looked at the pots he had created, Henry no longer focused on their technical imperfections. Instead, he saw their stories, the life they carried from the process of being made. They weren't just pots, they were reflections of freedom, creativity, and acceptance. In slowing down and appreciating the present, Henry also reconnected with himself and the people around him. He no longer felt the need to prove himself or push himself beyond his limits. Instead, he allowed himself to live in harmony with what was, rather than what he thought should be. Henry's life had become simpler but richer. He no longer worried about having enough skill or creating perfect works of art. Instead, He allowed himself to experiment and play with new ideas he had never dared to try before. Through this, he found a deeper connection with his craft, with nature, and with the people around him. He also spent more time wandering around the village where he had grown up, reconnecting with old friends and listening to their stories. He felt more rooted in his community, appreciating the warmth of simple conversations and shared moments. Whether it was chatting over a cup of tea or watching the sunset together, these moments brought Henry a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known for a long time. Not only did Henry reconnect with his friends, but he also began to share the lessons he had learned. He expanded his workshop to welcome more students, just as he had taught Lucas. But now, he wasn't just teaching the techniques of pottery. He was passing on the wisdom of accepting imperfection and learning to live in the moment. Henry saw that by helping others discover their own paths, he was enriching his own life as well. Ultimately, Henry understood that his journey wasn't just about creating pottery, it was about learning how to live. It was about loving and appreciating the simple, imperfect things that made life so beautiful. Through reconnecting with himself and the world around him, Henry had found a life that was full of meaning, peace, and joy. One day, while working in his workshop, Henry decided it was time to create something entirely different. A piece that would reflect everything he had learned about life, acceptance, and imperfection. He selected a piece of clay that he would have once discarded for being too impure. It was rough, filled with tiny inconsistencies. But Henry saw potential in it. He believed that these imperfections would make the pot truly unique, a reflection of the natural process rather than an idealized vision of perfection. Slowly, Henry began to shape the clay, moving his hands gently, without the pressure of needing to get everything right. He allowed the clay to form naturally, without forcing it into a mold of perfection. Instead of trying to fix every uneven curve or smooth out every bump, Henry embraced the way the clay responded to his touch. As the pot took shape, he noticed a small crack forming in the body of the piece. In the past, this would have been a cause for frustration. But now, Henry welcomed it. He saw the crack not as a flaw, but as part of the pot's story. Something that made it unique. Something that carried the mark of its creation. When the pot was finished and fired in the kiln, Henry took it out and admired it. It wasn't technically perfect, but to him, it was the most perfect piece he had ever made. The crack, the uneven edges, the natural flow of the clay, all of it spoke to him of the journey he had been on. It was a symbol of his acceptance, his growth, and his realization that imperfection is what gives life its beauty. Henry decided to showcase this special pot at a local art exhibition. For the first time, he brought a piece that didn't hide its flaws. A piece that wore its imperfections proudly. In the past, Henry had only exhibited his most technically perfect pieces. But now he wanted to share the story of his journey with others through this pot. As the exhibition began, Henry felt a flicker of nervousness. He wasn't sure how people would react. Would they only see the flaws? Would they understand the deeper meaning behind the piece? But despite his doubts, Henry knew that he had created something true to himself. And that was enough. To his surprise, many visitors stopped to admire the pot, lingering in front of it longer than they did with his other works. They didn't focus on the crack or the imperfect shape. Instead, they seemed to sense the story the pot was telling. The story of acceptance, of letting go of perfection, and of finding beauty in the natural process. Some people asked Henry about how he had created the piece. And when he shared his journey of learning to embrace imperfection, they resonated with the message. They appreciated that the pot wasn't just a piece of pottery, but a reflection of life itself. They, too, saw their own lives mirrored in the pot. That each of them, like the pot, carried their own cracks and flaws. But these were what made them unique and beautiful. Henry was overwhelmed by the positive response. People didn't just see a cracked pot, they saw a work of art that told a story about what it means to be human. And in that moment, Henry realized that what he had once considered flaws were now seen as strengths. Something that gave the piece its own character and presence. After the exhibition, Henry felt a deep sense of peace. He had finally come to terms with the lesson he had been trying to learn for so long. Perfection wasn't the goal. It was never about creating something flawless. It was about creating something true. Something with meaning. And something that embraced the natural imperfections of life. The pot he had made wasn't just a piece of art. It was a symbol of his journey from a potter obsessed with perfection to an artist who had found joy in imperfection. It was the culmination of all the lessons he had learned about letting go, accepting flaws, and loving the process rather than the result. Henry no longer felt the need to create perfect pots. Instead, he focused on the joy of creation, letting each piece tell its own story. His life was quieter now, no longer dominated by unrealistic expectations. As he reflected on his journey, Henry felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had learned the most important lesson of all, that accepting imperfection, both in his work and in life, was the key to finding true happiness and peace. And with this realization, he began to see beauty everywhere. In the marks left by the creative process. In the small moments of everyday life. Henry was no longer the potter who chased perfection. He had become an artist at peace with the world and himself. His pots, though not flawless, carried a quiet elegance. The beauty of imperfection. Of a life lived fully. To Henry, that was the real beauty. Looking at the world through this new lens, Henry found comfort and serenity in knowing that life, much like his pottery, was not meant to be perfect. Instead, it was meant to be appreciated for its natural imperfections, its unexpected cracks, and the unique stories they told. And in that acceptance, Henry finally found the peace he had been searching for all along. Henry had finally found peace. But his journey was not just about reaching this point. He had learned that life itself was a continuous process. Much like the art of making pottery. Just as each piece of clay told its own story through its cracks and imperfections, Henry understood that his own life had been shaped by every failure, every flaw, and every lesson along the way. Now, as he reflected on everything, Henry saw that his life had been a journey toward acceptance. He had spent so much time fighting against imperfection, thinking that perfection was the ultimate goal. But in reality, perfection was never attainable. Nor was it necessary. The beauty of life, like the beauty of pottery, lay in its imperfections. These imperfections were what made each moment, each experience, and each person truly unique. Sitting in his workshop, surrounded by his pots, Henry realized that the cracks in his creations mirrored the cracks in his own life. But rather than hide them, he had learned to embrace them. He had learned that it was okay to be flawed, to make mistakes, and to not have everything figured out. It was all part of the process, part of being human. In the days that followed the exhibition, Henry continued to work in his workshop with a newfound sense of purpose. He no longer measured his success by the number of pots he sold or by how technically perfect they were. Instead, he measured it by the joy and peace he felt while creating, by the connections he made with others, and by the stories his work told. Henry's students, like Lucas, began to understand this philosophy as well. They learned not only the craft of pottery but also the deeper lessons that came with it. They saw that each pot was a reflection of their own journey, a journey filled with both triumphs and mistakes. And they began to appreciate that the flaws in their work were not something to be ashamed of, but something to be celebrated. Through his teaching, Henry passed on the wisdom he had gained. He taught his students that life, like pottery, was about embracing the process. It was about living fully, accepting both the good and the bad, and finding beauty in the unexpected. As time went on, Henry's workshop became a place where people came not just to learn pottery, but to find themselves. His students left not only with new skills but with a deeper understanding of life and of themselves. They learned to see the beauty in their own imperfections and to live with a sense of peace that came from accepting things as they were. Henry's legacy was not just the pots he made but the impact he had on those around him. Through his work and his teachings, he showed that perfection was not the goal in life. Instead, the goal was to embrace imperfection, to live fully, and to find joy in the simple act of creation. In his quiet moments, Henry would still look at the pots he had made and smile. He no longer saw the cracks as mistakes but as beautiful reminders of the journey he had been on. He knew now that life was not about being perfect but about being real, about accepting oneself and others just as they are. And so, Henry continued to live his life with grace, finding peace in each new day, in each new creation, and in each new imperfection that came his way. He had learned the most important lesson of all, that true beauty, true peace, and true happiness came not from perfection, but from accepting and loving everything as it is. I have a small favor to ask. If you know someone who might also benefit from a peaceful bedtime routine, whether it's a friend, family member, or colleague, please consider sharing MaicaLan with them. A calming story can make a world of difference in helping someone unwind and find tranquility. And by sharing, you're helping others discover this space of calm and restfulness, just like you have. Thank you again for being part of this growing community of peace and relaxation. I wish you the sweetest dreams and hope the night carries you into a serene world of stillness and comfort. I can't wait to see you again for our next story. Sleep well, and may the quiet night embrace you with peace and tranquility.